Everyone keeps telling you to learn the WarGear basics by looking at public tech, but what do they mean? What does that imply exactly, and how does it work? It means a few things: viewing and loading public schematics, pasting them so you can look at them. If you want to learn how to fight with the machines, you search for things that have to be activated before or during the fight, learn how to use all of the cannons and learn the infrastructure so you can navigate properly. If you want to get better at building technology yourself, you probably want to cut parts out and examine them closely to see how things are wired exactly and what architectures and techniques are used. You can look at the way cannons, shields and missiles are placed and think about why it was that they were placed this way, and if there may have been better options. To test that specific knowledge, you can even take the cutout parts from public WarGears, arrange them in a way you think makes more sense, and create your own WarGear that way. Alright, first you have to somehow access that public technology you are trying to learn from. The way to do that can differ depending on whichever server you play on. Usually players are very willing to help, and a simple in-game chat question will probably leave you with knowledge of the required method. I'll perform the demonstrations on SteamWar for the purpose of this video. Keep in mind that the process of loading the public schematics might have changed since this video was created. Right now, executing /sham-GUI opens this interface. Now I can click on this glass block and get a list of all the publicly available technology. You might already have a specific rule set in mind that you want to learn. If not, that's totally fine, just pick any random schematic. But let's just say I'm currently super invested in WarGears, so I'll sort by schematic type, go to the WarGears and load one of them. If your goal is to just look at the infrastructure, get a general idea of the WarGear, maybe cut some parts out for inspection, you can paste the schematic anywhere and do whatever you want to. If your goal is to see what the cannons are actually capable of and how to properly use them, you will have to paste the schematic in a way that will let you kind of simulate a real battle. The servers usually use plot and dummy systems for this purpose. This is a WarGear plot, that's a dummy, and that's where you're supposed to put your WarGear. Usually public tag should have been copied from a specific point, the copy point. That means if you stand at those copy points and paste the WarGear, it should theoretically be aligned with the dimensions and distance to the dummy it is supposed to. If that is not the case, you will have to try and manually align it yourself. Leftover parts of the frame and markings on the floor should be indicated enough to do that. Worst case, you can always look the dimensions and distances up on the server websites. Now that everything is in place, we can start looking for everything I mentioned before. I'll search for things that have to be activated before the fight first, as that is important knowledge to have when fighting. If you don't activate automatic cannons, there is a very high chance that the enemy will hit the TNT reservoirs during the fight and cause mass destruction by the following chain reaction. If you don't activate shields, you will receive damage more quickly than if you did. To find anything in the WarGear, it is probably easiest to go into spectator mode. You can go the traditional route of typing the corresponding command or toggle it by pressing F3 and N at the same time. Roaming around in a public, you'll often soon find a room with some concentrated wiring. Here I find a button that extends the WarGear's shields, another button to fire the FAs, and I see that I'm supposed to activate that one with 9 seconds left on the pre-battle countdown, and 2 levers that switch the FA's modes so they hit higher. Now I'll just randomly pick a single cannon and demonstrate how I would try to understand it from a pure usage and battle point of view. Since stabs are always important to know well in WarGears, I'll look for a cannon that looks stabby to me first. I judge this by positioning and knowledge of architectures that you will also develop over time. This one looks like a stab cannon, so let's try to load it. If you want to practice the real situation, you can try loading the cannon in survival mode, as the block placement range is different there, so there is a chance that you mess up your muscle memory by only loading in creative, at least if you load in a way that you couldn't in survival. Every spot that has an observer is usually safe to load. If there is no observer and you're still supposed to load the spot, there are often marks like red blocks. There is no 100% failsafe method other than looking at the actual redstone though to be absolutely certain. Worst case, you just have to trial and error for a bit. You should usually avoid placing TNT above blocks with extended hitboxes like walls and fences, because TNT will fall through these blocks when being primed and then destroy the cannon. In some edge cases you should still load such a spot, but it's not very standard in publics. Before you shoot, I suggest that you turn on traces and make them visible so you can see what actually happens. After shooting, I am assured it is a stab cannon and it hits quite low by default. We will have to fire it many times during testing, and there are a few ways to make that process less tedious. You could, for example, load the cannon once, copy it with World Edit, and then paste it again with /P-O after shooting. Some servers also feature a loader that records you loading and shooting the cannon once and will then take over and keep repeating what you did. Anyways, now we can investigate all of the things that are adjustable about the cannon. There is, for example, this quite obvious wall here, a high comfort feature. I find out, by reading the signs, that this one has toggleable ascent modes, so this cannon can hit at 5 different heights. Something that is always crucial to test is whether you can switch modes while the cannon is already loaded. Sometimes you cannot, and mode switching will prime or push some of the loaded TNT and destroy the cannon because of that. You should also test if it's possible to desync or otherwise mess up the mode switches by toggling too many modes or by doing it too quickly. By testing this, I learned that it actually is possible to desync this cannon's mode switches. I think in this case when you toggle some specific ones together, so if that happens it will for example shoot in the lowest mode if you select the middle one. There are also visible repeaters here, but they don't have any description signs, which is usually an indicator that they should probably not be messed with. To confirm this, I set one of them to setting 4 and let the other one sit at 1. When priming, I immediately notice that now the entirety of one side is priming later. This creates something called a propellant phase, which is incredibly bad because now you will not have the impact of all propellant hitting at the same time, so there is an immense loss of pressure. A cannon like this will very likely blow up as a result, so I will remember to not touch these repeaters in the future. Because it has very high pressure, even for a stab cannon, it has 48 propellant, you can count this easily with world edit. A normal to good amount would be around 24. I try leaving out a little bit of propellant and check if it still works. It has this high amount, I assume, to make rebound shifting easier. You can see that there is only this single vertical barrel here that allows for all of the ascent modes to exist. To successfully travel through that vertical part of the barrel, the TNT has to be able to move up all of that height in one calculation. I learned that if I leave out one propellant, it still stabs, but can't quite reach the highest mode anymore. And if I leave out 2, it blows itself up in the higher modes. I also test if it has any way of breaking shields. To do that, I just put an endstone block in front of the dummy. How thick that wall should be is written in the rule sets on the server's websites as how far WarGears may extend. Now I fire the cannon normally and see that it stabs for a single phase and then stops. This is an indicator of overpressure to me, as this means that during the next phase of calculation, the position of the TNT entities has not been freed yet, so they slam against the endstone and lose their Z velocity. I can try to circumvent this by using less propellant, so lower pressure, because that will make the points of calculation be closer together. Using 1 to 3 less propellant, the same problem still exists, but using 4 less, so 44, it actually stabs again. Now I seem to not get as deep as before, which makes sense because I not only have 48 propellant, but also 48 projectiles. And measuring the depth of the channel, I see that it's 49 blocks long. This is plausible, since the rule is kind of 1 block of depth per projectile. Sometimes you get one deeper because of some factors like the lower resistance of the design layer. We found out earlier that leaving out propellant prevents me from using higher modes, so now I know that if the enemy has a shield, I can only effectively use the cannon in the lowest two. In higher modes, I would waste time breaking the shield and only being able to damage effectively after that, so I might want to use other cannons to cover higher zones on a shielded enemy. I think we know this cannon pretty well now, but there are some additional bits of knowledge that can be helpful, like knowing how far you have to run away from the cannon to not take damage anymore. In theory that should be 8 blocks, but in infrastructure this often becomes less straightforward as there are corners and stuff, so just test where you have to stand to be safe. I often see people running so far away from the cannon that they end up losing time when getting back to it. It's also nice to know how to get out of the cannon in case you fall into it. Figuring that out mid-battle can, with some cannons, be really stressful. If the cannon you're testing is semi-automatic, there might be a maximum speed you can load it at before you overload, which can stuck the loading mechanism or just blow the cannon up. Sometimes you get intel by a scout that your position is going to be hit soon, or the cannon primes weirdly and you smell bad things happening, in which case it can prove very useful for damage control to be able to unload it quickly, which you can also practice. And there are some cannons where removing or adding a few blocks can alter many different things like where it hits or what kind of damage it does. In some edge cases that could also be a win or lose kind of factor. If you want to really get to know a WarGear, you should consider going through a testing and thought process like this with every cannon that it features. It might sound like a very tedious thing to do, and it totally can be sometimes, but it will help you immensely with winning battles, feeling more in control of the situation overall, and just thinking in more strategic ways. Later on, if you start building WarGears that feature nothing but your own technology, you will know the cannons that you use very well anyways, so you won't have to learn anything entirely unfamiliar anymore. After you got to know all of the cannons in the WarGear, it is time to get a solid grasp of how to navigate it. Flying around inside the WarGear in spectator mode will give you a solid understanding of where the cannons are positioned. Actually knowing how to get from point A to B consistently and quickly is usually a different story though. One way to gain that ability, for example, would be to go into survival mode, set yourself a destination like the leftmost lower stab, try to go there as quickly as possible, and then repeat that process. It's not unlikely that you want to do exactly that later in battle, navigating from one specific cannon to another one. May it be because you want to hit a certain position and can only do it with one cannon, or maybe there is just one other cannon left. One more advanced thing about publics and WarGears in general that you can analyze is strengths and weaknesses. After firing all cannons of your public of choice in all modes, you might realize that there are a few spots that are only covered by very few cannons. If you wait too long with using those few cannons, you could frequently run into situations where they are destroyed too early and you can't hit these spots anymore. Maybe after spending a little bit of time with the public's infrastructure, you realize that there are some places that are just harder to get to, and that you maybe want to visit them less for that reason. And also there could be some cannons that you deem particularly weak or strong comparatively, which might also influence your priorities. Most of the things that you learn by going through all of these steps are not as particular to the single bits of technology that you look at as you might think. The analysis process is something that you get faster and faster at as you do it a few times, and you will start seeing patterns in cannon choices, architectures, positioning, infrastructure, and so on. You will also likely develop preferences and opinions that could be the fuel to your own private technology and your ability to judge whether what you created is good or bad by your own standards. Now let me show you how to cut out cannons and learn their purely technical side. There are a few ways that you can cut out a cannon. The first quite obvious one would be to just cut away everything else in blocks and slices until you have only the cannon left. To do this, simply select areas with World Edit, so get the wooden X by typing /want into the chat and mark areas with left and right click, then execute /set0 to change all blocks you selected to air. Another method is to try to select and copy the cannon, not cut around it, either by using /noclip and then selecting the area again with left and right click, or by going into spectator mode and selecting the area with the /pos1 and 2 commands. I suggest two copy and paste procedures for this method. Either you just select, copy, reset the plot so the frame is empty, and then /p-o to paste only that selection into the now empty frame, or you copy the area from a point you have a reference to, like a specific corner or just the regular copy point, and then go to a different empty plot and paste it from that exact position. When copying instead of cutting, you will very likely still have to cut a little bit because you selected too much, or recopy because you didn't select everything. If you are ever unsure whether something is safe to cut away or not, you could try to understand if it could influence the cannon in any way, or simply cut it out and see if the cannon still works. After you went through any of these procedures, you should be left with a single, hopefully still functional cannon that you can now examine. I will list a few things that you could take a look at. In public technology, many solutions will not be optimal, but they will help you gain basic understanding. Priming. How is all of the TNT activated? It could just be a wall of observers. But what is used to trigger the observers, and how and when does the signal get there? Phases. In which order is the TNT activated and why? How is the delay between the phases created? And how many phases are there in total, and why could that be? Compression. After the TNT has been primed, how does it get to the launch point, and which, if any, techniques have been used to make sure everything is perfectly aligned? Signal transmission. Is simple redstone dust and repeater wiring used, or observer lines, or setups with pistons and slime? Launch point architecture. Which blocks are used to create the horizontal and vertical angles? And are there parts in the launch point that were chosen specifically to make mode switching possible? Chamber architecture. How many chambers are there? How high or wide are they? How are they positioned relative to each other? Mode switches. What are the mode switch controls and how are they wired? I'm talking about levers, repeaters, fence gates, node blocks, connected to the launch point or rebound blocks, etc., with the purpose of changing the trajectory. Alright, and that's it. The most important tip to keep in mind with the examination of to you unknown technology is probably that the more confusing something is to you, the higher the chance that it might be worth investigating more thoroughly. Sometimes all you learn is that a problem was solved in an overcomplicated way, but sometimes you find some very smart solutions or usage of block and entity interactions. And after really taking some tech apart and trying to understand it, attempting to apply that knowledge will be the next step towards your own creations. Seeing it is one thing, but building something on your own is again an entirely different story. Eventually you'll be able to apply the patterns and architectures yourself and create new and possibly better ones too. Before you randomly jump into building some random cannon though, you might want to take a look at what simulation is. I covered that partially in a different video, All You Need to Know to Build a WarGear, a guide to working with TNT. It basically means using tools provided to you by the WarGears servers to simulate what a cannon shot would look like by just building the launch point and putting set amounts of TNT at specified points at exact times. This helps you know exactly how much TNT you need when and where, which is the starting point to most cannon builds. Anyways, I really hope that this video helped you find motivation to get started with examining and building technology.